And this webinar series is just, Steve is presenting for us on the first one of this series that will focus on really kind of building resilience in smallholder farming systems. So the TOPS program is led by Save the Children, and it's a consortium project. Mercy Corps is the agriculture and natural resource management lead, together with CORE, who focus on knowledge management, Food for the Hungry, social behavior change, and Tango International, monitoring and evaluation. And Save the Children as the lead also lead gender, commodity management, and nutrition. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Greg. Greg is a colleague that works on Mercy Corps and has really been involved in the kind of the larger agroecology resilience work that we've been doing within the agency that Steve's work is also kind of linked to. So Greg, at this point, I'll hand over to you.
Hi, everyone. Just to confirm you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, Greg.
Okay. I was hearing a little echo, but wonderful. So thanks, Andrea, and it's great to be here. We're really happy to have Steve Moore with us today to talk about biointensive agriculture and to go deeper into agroecology with us. As Andrea mentioned, my name is Greg Scarborough, and I work currently with Mercy Corps as their senior advisor on food security and nutrition. And just to share a little bit, for the past couple of years in our food security unit and our agriculture work, we've been exploring the question of how we can build resilience for smallholder farmers to a number of shocks, both climate related and then going on into shocks regarding conflict and market shocks and food price shocks. And part of that work has been to explore agroecology as a production method, as a sort of a framework in how we approach agriculture. And this led to working together with TOPS to put together an event last January on where we had a number of practitioners, primarily from America, who also work internationally, to discuss their methods for designing in smallholder farm systems, designing production systems, designing water systems, designing whole systems to build resilience for households and resilience of the agroecosystem itself. So just in the last point, we have a few tools Mercy Corps produced on that, which you can find on the FSN website as well as on Mercy Corps' website. And one is a screening tool to look at agroecological risk and resilience. So there's a bunch of questions that agencies and practitioners can consider in designing their program to kind of check and really question critically whether their design is building resilience or potentially adding to vulnerability of smallholder farmers. And another is a discussion paper on agroecology and resilience for smallholder farming systems. So with that, I'd like to now move on to present Steve Moore. He's currently a teacher directing the agroecology program at Elon University. He's worked not only as a researcher and teacher, educator for the last decades, but also has gardened organically for over 40 years and has been using biointensive techniques and teaching them for over 20 years. Steve was also at our January event, and he had a lot to share that everyone was more interested in hearing about, and that's why we decided to welcome him here for the first of this webinar series to give an introduction to biointensive agriculture. And have to leave sooner. We'd like your feedback because there are opportunities to possibly ask Steve back to go deeper technically into some of the areas which we can only glance over today. And before I introduce Steve, just finally, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. We'll be collecting them as we go and feeding them to Steve, and we'll have about 40 minutes for the presentation and 15 minutes for questions afterwards. So with that, I will introduce Steve Moore. Feel free to begin, Steve. Thank you.
If you're having any problems, please indicate that in your chat box, and we'll try to make adjustments as best we can. I'm excited to present this material. There's a lot to cover in because of the 40 plus years of work that's gone into understanding a little bit more about sustainability via the biointensive approach. So at times, if you have questions, please sing out. We have monitors for the chat box that can answer questions as we go. And then, as Greg mentioned, we'll bring it on for 20 minutes of more formal questions and answers at the end. So let's start in. What is biointensive farming? And it's a millennial practice with basically permanent beds, typically organic, low-tech, hand-based production used in so many countries. And you think, well, how is this different from what I've seen in general gardening and practices from antiquity? And so let's go ahead and look at some of these differences because they do attempt to approach sustainability. Currently, biointensive agriculture is used, and you can see here, in Southeast Asia, Africa, Europe, and Central America and South America. And so it is practiced. So the principle of close plant spacing, permanent beds, permanent pathways is not in any way new, but what we're going to explore today is adding on to it layers of understanding of land use, diet, resource constraints, and so forth that help it to approach that, increase resilience and approach sustainability. So in its basic form, it is an organic form of agriculture. And I just want to mention, for those of you who work with conventional agriculture, meaning synthetic chemicals and so forth, and organic, mention a 30-year Rodale Institute Farming Systems Trial Study that you can access at the rodaleinstitute.org website. And just a quick thing about organic to kind of put in perspective this type of organic agriculture. Overall, for 30 years, virtually corn and soybeans were equal. In drought years, there was a 31% increase in yield in organic systems trials over the conventional synthetic chemical. Water infiltration was 15 to 20% higher. Income from 2008 to 2010, those were the numbers that were worked with at the time, were 68% higher in income. And there was less energy use and lower greenhouse gas emissions. So that's from a 30-year trial of organic that helps us build on why we should consider organic. Now, organic in itself may not be sustainable, and I think that as you look at the biointensive approach, it may provide a pathway to that. So what makes biointensive a little bit different is soil quality and deep soil structure, closed loop fertility and effective composting, intensive plant spacings, multi-crop efficiency and biological effectiveness, growing fertility, which is pretty unique. We talk about raising cover crops and composting them, but seldom do we actually design for carbon farming. And we're going to explore these a little further. Customized complete diet. When we approach gardening, I mean, out of our gardens and farms, we want nutrition. And seldom do we design our gardens or our farms for complete nutrition, and Grow Biointensive has the tools to do that. Open pollinated seeds, we get yields superior to either hybrids or to GMOs with using these principles in a holistic way. And as we know, it gives increased food sovereignty. That's what we're really after here. I think all of us that work in this type of work, we're after food security and food sovereignty. And the pathway to that is through sustainability and resilience, and biointensive can provide one pathway to that. So let's look at some of we don't have time to go too much in depth, but I wanted to highlight some of the details of soil health that are emphasized in the grow biointensive system. So when we look at soil composition by volume, we see that half of soil is pore space. If we have deep, good, well-structured soil, we can just add significant amount of water retention to the capacity to store water. So if you're at 1% soil organic matter, you can store 160,000 liters of water retention. But if you move to even 3%, you actually triple that. So it makes a significant difference of storing your water in your soil. We see in a lot of arid countries where they're getting surges of rain events that dump significant amounts of water that virtually runs off. Biointensive allows you to store that water both in soil structure, pore space, and also in increased organic matter. We reflect on the depth of roots. If you look at this for some common vegetable crops, you'll notice those incremental depths. Those increments are not inches, they're feet. And a lot of work's been done at looking at the capacity of crops to go deep. That depth allows for retention of nutrients as they cycle through soil strata and horizons, and also to maximize yield in a given area and become drought resistant. That also allows for tighter plant spacings, which we'll see can be a significant improvement as well. So let's look at this nutrient availability. If organic matter is the holy grail of soil quality, when we look at nutrient availability in this chart, we see that pH is across the top and bottom, and the availability is the width of the line. That we want to be in that 6.5 to 7% because that gives us the basic elements we need. High organic matter actually buffers that one full pH point and allows for more nutrient availability and subsequent crop growth. Coming to that plant spacing issue, if you look in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, you'll see the condensed biointensive version of intensive planting. Saw many of those practices in those first slides on several continents. If you look at the right, the traditional row spacing, you actually see plants above and below the surface, and then areas of really desert that we create by trying to till out areas or remove any weeds and other vegetation. Nature does not like a vacuum and will fill it with something. On the upper left, you see the bed completely covered, which reduces transpiration, retains CO2 at a higher level underneath the plant canopy. All this is fairly well documented and allows for increased plant growth. And when you move into multi-cropping systems, it allows for some of the induced disease suppression and migration of nutrients through mycorrhizal associations and so on that really allow for the high yields that we see in biointensive practices. In essence, we create a much better microclimate and retain a lot more growing in a lot smaller area. So how do we get to a deeper soil penetration? There's a whole lot of tools. This is a modern U-bar that allows deep soil preparation. Many countries, this would not be a tool that could be used. But as we look at some of the more traditional cultures, now we start seeing more and more tools that could have application in wider farming practices that are currently used and have been used for centuries. And we forget that nature does its own double digging or own deep soil preparation with roots, especially in forested areas. Here's some daikon radishes at 60 plus centimeters, 2 feet of depth that from biointensive beds that actually do their own soil digging and loosening and preparation of soil structure and adding organic matter. So foundational to grow biointensive is this idea that we can grow a complete diet. And by complete diet, we focus primarily, initially at least, on calories, calcium, and protein, and then expand into some amino acids. But that is a representation of what a quarter amount of acreage it is to grow a complete diet. So the biointensive allows us to take it through a series of forms, so we actually design the system. And I think that's important. As we look at sustainability, we can get a kind of a good feeling about it, and for obvious reasons. But when it gets to the nitty-gritty, you really need numbers to know. If you have a bank account, you really need to know if your interest is exceeding your expenditures or withdrawals, and that is a number. So coming up with personal diet needs and then working through to form all the nutrients that you might need. We'll explore some of this a little more. Actually designing for compost crops so that you close the fertility loop on your farm. Adding income sheets so that you can derive income from it and incorporate that into the whole farm design, where your income crops that you're selling off your farm, you actually compensate for those in your compost crops so that you can grow enough fertility. And then some of the all-important work in water efficiency and energy efficiency. The result is that you end up with a holistic approach that's seldom seen in today's agriculture, taking it from human needs to the needs of the soil itself and protection of the environment. So calorie needs, the sheet helps, as we see in many forms when we work on this, looking at climate, gender, weight, age, sleep, rest, all the things that go into the physiological understanding of caloric needs. And then through a series of sheets, and although this is hard to read, what I hope you derive from looking at this is that there is a way that you can look at individual crops and really come up with a holistic plan to meet the nutritional needs of an individual, a family, or a community in a very comprehensive way. So the culmination of that, at least in the evolution to this point of the Grow Biointensive method, is our Form 10, which calculates the carbohydrates, fats, linoleic acids, so forth, 9 of the essential amino acids, 8 minerals, and vitamins. Not fully complete, but probably fairly much more thought than many others approaches to feeding people. Okay, we're going to switch over to another PowerPoint quickly here. Thank you, Patrick. So now we're switching over to compost crops and closing the fertility loop. We've kind of have a handle on what we need to feed people. What do we need to feed the soil in return that it can continue to feed us? And what we've seen, as you can imagine, in an 8-year trial in Aguascalientes, Mexico, as part of a master's thesis, a master's PhD thesis at University of Aguascalientes, Mexico, we see that a positive feedback. Obviously, the more carbon you produce, the greater yields you have of carbon-producing crops and diet-producing crops, and that continues to where you reach an equilibrium. We haven't reached that yet in that trial, but after 8 years, we've tripled the amount of organic matter in the soil. Before we get too worried about, well, it's hard enough to grow diet crops in many countries. how are we ever going to get farmers to grow compost crops in addition to that? And the answer is that many of the food substances we eat already are great compost crops, including maize, grain crops, and things like sunflower seeds as well. So in essence, these crops do double duty and aren't just singularly used on the farm. So we have a carryover of carbon materials from our Form 7, which is the diet design, and then we add in additional carbon and nitrogen if it's needed and go back and revise the diet design to help match what the soil needs. We look at a carbon to nitrogen ratio in that form as well, which really helps us to know a lot about the effectiveness of the compost and the quality of the compost and the return of the nutrients to the garden. Changes in compost nitrogen or carbon nitrogen ratios, we can actually lose carbon and nitrogen from the system that we can't afford to do on low resource use or anything attaining sustainability. So calculating the cured compost per bed or 100 square feet, we can determine the amount of return to the land, and we understand from peer review articles that about 2 cubic feet of cured compost per 100 square feet of growing area will maintain the carbon and many of the other nutrients. And so the goal is to create a closed loop system. It'd be easier to do if we used human manure, but we've tried to do it without the use of that. Someday I hope that factors in a little bit more importantly. When this is all done, it was a surprise, always a surprise to me when I work on these diet designs in various cultures and capacities around the globe, that there's a lot of, we determine bed crop months or how many months of the year is something growing on a piece of land. So obviously a perennial would have 12 bed crop months, but something like millet could vary from 45 days to 90 days. And as you design your garden, when you look at bed crop months, you realize there's holes in your garden where you could possibly grow. Now, a lot of this is weather dependent on the wet, rainy seasons and dry seasons and temperature variations as well. But it helps the practitioner calculate and be able to utilize the resources at hand more effectively and find places and crops that fill in the empty spaces of the garden. Those are important because the garden always growing something is key to keeping soil biology moving forward, protecting the inputs of carbon and so forth that we're trying to attain. We can lose a lot if it's not covered, both from erosion and a whole host of reasons. It's important to remember that the biology of the soil, in a large part, makes the nutrients available to the plants. And that area, the rhizosphere, or area around the roots, is 100 times the biological activity of other areas of our gardens and farms. So here's some, been doing a lot of talk, and let's look at some pictures of how this grow biointensive method has played out. You can see some pictures. Left is sunflowers. The pole that's going up is 10 feet tall. The sunflowers are certainly robust and producing far in excess of averages, as are the Jerusalem artichokes, another great carbon crop on the right. Here's the forms, again, not needing to go through in detail at this point, but the idea is you can derive a tremendous amount of information from them. How does this work out in the basic form? So if people eat 60% grain crops, which have highly concentrated calories to them per amount that's fed, or amount that we eat, because we do have constraints on how much we can eat every day. And they provide a lot of carbon. And then root crops that provide the most amount of calories per unit area, Irish potatoes or white potatoes and sweet potatoes are, in fact, the highest calorie producers per unit area. But they produce virtually no carbon to return to the soil, and then vegetable crops that supply vitamins and minerals. If somehow we keep to this basic idea of proportions, then we're going to be able to supply ourselves and our garden with sufficient amounts of nutrients for both the long-term maintenance of ourselves and the maintenance of our gardens. Just some images of the crops that we've harvested over the years out of our garden from biointensive practices. The white ruler is a scale ruler at 30 centimeters, 12 inches. Yields of carrots, we were able to attain, these are fall harvested carrots in Pennsylvania. We were able to attain 480 pounds of carrots in 100 square feet. So incredibly high yields in very small areas. Some corn. I love eating food. I love growing food, but I really love to see carbon. And you can see that picture on the left, a lot of carbon in that corn crop. And that's in a fairly arid, sandy soil in the coastal plains of North Carolina. Move into another garden, a second-year garden at my university, Elon, and the two students on the right are actually 6 foot. So you can see in short order the great yields of corn and carbon. Open pollinated seeds, we see the obvious reasons for control of food. It's hard to have food sovereignty if we leave seeds open to speculation, politics, production in other areas of the world, and so forth. So, and it also allows for on-farm breeding, and particularly in areas where multi-cropping might demand some breeding changes to accommodate increased yields in adaptive situations. Oftentimes we need to look, and we're familiar with this because in sub-Saharan Africa, people take a chance on corn and they live off of sorghum. So trying to understand how much calories can be produced per gallon of water and then factoring that back into some of the forms allows us to really take an objective look at what are the kind of risk management in terms of finding resilience depending on weather, climate changes, and dietary needs, cultural expectations, and so forth. My own particular specific work in this has been energy use, and I'm going to quickly go through this so we have plenty of time for questions. But even in organic systems, we're not seeing a balance of the equation where we're actually producing more food or energy in this form of food than we are expending. And so somehow we need to come in balance and with this so that we can achieve some sense of sustainability. I don't know all the outcomes, but I can show for studies, and this is available in peer-reviewed publications if people are interested in citing them. So looking at an energy flow chart for our farm, and then compost energy flow chart, we assigned values for the labor that we did work of 1 to 4 and based them on climate factors, weight and gender of worker, and time required to do a task. This gave us the labor cost, energetic labor cost in calories for any task. We put those tasks on a spreadsheet that we could draw from, and then the embodied energy of the tools we used prorated over periods of time. I feel fairly comfortable with this sheet because by the time I developed it, I had farmed as a family farm and gardened additionally for over 20 years. I feel confident that the numbers and projections of tool use are pretty close to the mark. From this, we looked at a value. This is our own farm with some onions on it. We grew a general market type farm and had a large diversity of market crops. We grew about 30,000 onions. You can see the dense plant spacings, but also the size. Size sells in the U.S. and it also creates calories. So there's a quarter in relationship to our onions. We tried to have, our average was 2/3 of a pound bulb size. So when we looked at this and had calculated all the amount of labor that went in, direct energy from irrigation, we had to irrigate 5 times that one year, and the embodied cost, it ended up to be approximately, for every calorie we invested in this biointensive technique, we returned 50 calories at the farm gate to back to feed people. So we really had quite a return on investment. In U.S. mechanized agriculture, we're running a deficit still in even in onions, which have a fairly high caloric value for a root crop per pound of food. So what are some of the additional benefits of biointensive? Sequestering carbon, increasing soil organic matter, reducing greenhouse gases, urban farming needs. It's been adopted as the official urban farming technique of Sri Lanka. Food sheds and food sovereignty, climate change adaptability, and that's where a lot of the resilience comes in. I am concerned about political environmental refugees in the future. This technique allows for quick adaptation and use. You can see and read some of these other ones. I think that an important thing that we have here is a set of tools. And if you go to growbiointensive.org or biointensive.net, there's a lot of self-teaching tools available, an opportunity to learn and grow on your own and advance the method, and also to utilize it in the whole diversity of countries. We have quite for the 44 years that Ecology Action has been working to promote biointensive and to research and understand it, that we have seen some remarkable progress and adoption. Here's one of we have a Manor House Teaching Center in Kitale, Kenya, and it's been ongoing for 25 years. This is another group in Kenya, GBAC. They have a long history in Thika. They won the Food Sovereignty Prize for the work they're doing there. About 2 million people have been trained in Africa, and in Central America, about 2.5 biointensivistas are using the technique in varying degrees, I should add. Not everybody's completely focused on sustainability. They use the pieces they want. It's hoped that we use all the pieces so that we do the ultimate goal of creating that food security and sovereignty through complete diets and fertility improvements to the soil. Recent conference that was held in the Dominican, in the DR, and quite a variety of countries were represented. A lot of work going forward with that. Some examples of people working in the field in Philippines and in Africa. And in the end, we seek to protect and enhance the natural world that we so depend on. The Grow Biointensive slogan is many gardens, one world. So I have a few additional slides that I would just leave up for now, and you're welcome to go back to them later as you wish. So I think our time, we're right on time at 11:40, and I'm going to turn the time back over to Greg, who's going to coordinate some of our questions.
Thank you, Steve. That was really informative, and definitely made me wish that we had a webinar for each one of those components, from the diet farming to the carbon farming to go deeper. It's such an extensive system, and definitely provides a unique way of looking more holistically at what's coming into the system and going out of the system than we're sometimes used to. And certainly something that is important when you consider sustainability and resilience of farmers. I'm going to jump in here. I just want to remind the people in the webinar to continue asking questions in the chat box, and we'll take those and we can feed them to Steve. There were a few initial questions that came up during the discussion, Steve. I just wanted to ask you quickly. One of them was with regards to the Sahel and whether you have any specific examples, perhaps from Ecology Action or through your research with other folks, of how this model has been applied successfully in Sahelian countries. Do you have any examples of that specifically?
Probably Senegal, I think, would have some examples. Kenya to some degree, I think. And we've seen a lot of work in that arid countries. It's hard because what primes the pump, so to speak, and so somehow you need to infuse some organic matter to get the system rolling to where you have that positive feedback. And there's always a discussion of how would you get some plant growth to start the system to where you can capitalize on these biointensive principles. And I think that there's a variety of ways to do that. The one I least like is importing, and either importing organic matter or synthetic or natural fertilizers, but that's an ongoing debate.
Yeah, it seems like your discussion there on selecting crops based on water use would pair very well, not just on a surface level, like let's choose one drought-tolerant plant, but on a real analysis about how much water the crops are using would pair really well with a lot of the work, the Food for Peace work in Sahel countries. And I think that, folks would benefit from, and it feeds into another question that came on, is that are some of these forms or these resources, and you did touch on that, but where are they available online that people can go back and, because it's hard sometimes to see all the slides, or is there a place that people can kind of look at these forms and see the analysis process a little more?
Yes, and Greg, they're available at growbiointensive.org. And you can go to the self-teaching or publications, and it'll have a whole host of free online publications in multiple languages. So that would be a good place to start. And also, we're developing a new site. I'm not even sure if it's live right now, but we're really close to having it live at biointensive.net that has a more modern presentation of materials and some of the newer formats of delivering materials. That is up and running right now, and you can enter the classroom, and see the principles in more graphic displays, and we're working on multiple languages and so forth. We're a very, very small organization and with limited resources, and so we can't expand at the rate we'd like to, but we're slowly getting there. The other thing I'd like to mention to the previous question about is that biointensive is a technique for intensive food production that we feel our goal is to approach sustainability. If we set that intensive production within the context of a permaculture or the permaculture techniques, it only enhances both permaculture ideals, and the permaculture enhances the biointensive within that. And I think that we're not standalone. We see a lot of benefits from a lot of other methods, and I think in the future webinars from this platform, we'll see more and more integration of opportunities to learn permaculture as well.
Great. Steve, one more question from Jared Myers. He was asking if these biointensive methods can be implemented on large-scale farms, or is the method primarily suited for smaller plots?
It's really designed for the small plot holder, but it could be expanded in basic principles of it could be expanded into other areas. I did some consulting in Nevada and worked with a grower that had quite a large acreage of commercial onions, and using some of the principles, they're sound agricultural techniques that are well proven. So it's our hope that people go to the ultimate level, but you can pick and choose what you want to use.
Great. I see another question coming in. As that question comes in, I just, I wanted to get a sense also, Steve, of there's been, having these conversations with people around agroecology and sustainability, and a lot of these methods you're talking about. Some of the folks we discussed this with talk a lot about the intensive time that's needed to employ some of these agroecology methods, and the concern with women's time in a lot of these countries. And I'm wondering if you have, seen in your direct experience implementing these methods on your farms or through Ecology Action, gotten any feedback or see that time as a barrier, or maybe it's different. Maybe that over the years that you need less time because of the energy put in the beginning. But could you address that kind of concern or perception that much more time and effort is needed to employ these type of methods?
Well, I think it's like anything. When you get good at something and practice that, you can make really good time, whether it's riding a bicycle or doing any particular activity. And I think that we've seen wide adoption of the techniques and practices, and people start at a basic level of understanding and move through it. I think the hardest thing to do is convince people. Seeing is believing. And this method has been best spread by farmer-to-farmer adoption. And so rather than be kind of a central location that does top-down distribution, we've tried to empower key community people, identify and empower them with information, and then let them teach and train their peers. When people see the results, they are moved to make a change. And that has included, at least in Kenya and in Central America, more male involvement in the farming and gardening than previous. They're excited to participate. There's a little 12-minute video on the Grow Biointensive website called Grow, and that might be just a fun little anecdote about this subject.
Great, thanks, Steve. There's another question here from Paul Barker. He's wondering the market gardens approach being a good example of the combination of biointensive, permaculture, and market gardening. Wondering whether the system could be improved. Is that intending to ask whether the biointensive system can be improved by combining these methods, Paul? Yeah. So can this biointensive system, Steve, be improved by integrating other elements of say permaculture design and market gardening, for example?
Yes, the biointensive could be improved by permaculture for sure. I think the key thing is, though, is that whole systems approach where it'd be easy to use the biointensive system to, quote, mine the soil because you're concentrating your plant growth in such a small area. But if you don't use all the components and produce your carbon, then you can get then you're really just needing to import carbon and fertility somehow, and then you've lost that quest of sustainability and subsequent food sovereignty. I think in the United States or other developed countries where we have such a plethora of organic matter inputs, amendments, and so forth, we forget often how much of the world is constrained by resources and how much that costs them politically and in food security over the long haul. And I think that the system not only addresses sustainability, and I'm not sure we're ready to fully address that in many countries, but it addresses directly sustainability and food sovereignty. In the end, the developing countries may end up having more knowledge and a better understanding of these principles than we do, and we may need to ask them back for what they've learned. We see that every time we work in Latin America, how much and how fast they're learning to work towards this idea of food security and food sovereignty.
Hey, so this is Patrick, and I just wanted to jump in because we're about to open up the lines for everybody. So we've had people typing in the chat box so far, but we're giving you microphone rights. So if anybody'd like to ask a question directly of Steve, you're welcome to activate your microphone. The way that you do that is if you look up to the top of your screen, you should see 4 icons across the top of your window. One of them is green, and that's your audio icon. That's what allows you to hear what's going on in the meeting. And then your second icon, just to the right of that green icon, is your microphone icon. So if you click on that, you can activate your mic and ask a question if you'd like. So I'll let you guys move forward then with that. So feel free to activate your mic, and I think Steve might have an interim question if people aren't ready with the mic yet.
We have, if no one has, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to go back to a question that had been asked earlier on, Steve, regarding there was a kind of a combination of questions coming in about what crops and vegetation were recommended to provide coverage during winter months in the Mid-Atlantic. That was during the period where you were talking about really analyzing the time of crops in each bed, and that you might have time to do some winter planning. And then there was the recommendation of 60% grain. There was a question of, do you find the average person knows how to process and harvest the grain?
The average person really doesn't and is probably slightly intimidated by it, but we do have some self-help publications on harvesting and tools. The latest version, the 8th edition of How to Grow More Vegetables, has a tools section in there to help people get started, and we're working on the 9th edition, which will have increasing numbers of low-tech alternate technology that allow people to process grains on their own homes, farms, communities. In terms of the kind of crops you can grow, this is where bed crop months become interesting. So winter wheat has a long bed crop month, from at least in the mid-Atlantic from say the end of October when Hessian fly season's over to the end of June. And you look at barley, almost equal in its capacity for nutrition. It spring planted here and has a much shorter. So selection of crops and bed crop months really means a lot. What does that mean? It means that I could possibly grow Austrian winter field pea in the winter and then a barley crop and increase the nitrogen on my farm and still maintain close to the same nutrition as comparing wheat to barley. But those crops of cowpea, in particular to the Mid-Atlantic, would be Austrian winter field pea, and the grain crops predominantly winter wheat, and then oats. For the early spring crops that we want to get a jump on, the oats seem to be a great crop to protect the soil, create that rhizosphere, hold on to nutrients, keep those the soil in good health, and then can be harvested and composted prior to an early spring planting.
Just wanted, that's great, Steve, and bring it. Another participant was mentioning that in the DRC they have a different kind of climatic condition, but feel they could maybe adapt this to improve the farming systems there. And I think that brings back a point that this isn't. It's not that you do the same thing everywhere, but you kind of need this analysis of climate. Or when we're talking about resilience and how we apply agroecology or this specific grow biointensive method or permaculture or other agroecological methods that we've been exploring through TOPS, that when we talk about resilience, we can also analyze how this can be used to address different shocks. So what are the kinds of climatic shocks that are facing the DRC, and put that into the model to specifically address those challenges, whether they're climate involved with too much moisture, too much or flooding or drought or market issues. So that was a good comment, Maluma. Thank you. Go ahead, Paul.
Steve. Hi, Steve. Thank you very much for coming to South Africa with John. We've been utilizing the teachings that you passed along to us nicely. Can you hear me?
I can, Paul. Good to hear your voice again.
Hey, good to hear you, man. Kind of off the combination or hybridization of systems, Steve. The market gardening side of things is becoming more and more important in our cities, and that's something Paula Osborne and I have been really doing a lot of work in, capacitating our peri-urban and marginalized farmers and assisting them to gain access to market. The largest challenge we face is obviously on the inputs. A lot of our rural and peri-urban farmers are not growing sufficient carboniferous crops to feed the soil. Do you think there's a middle of the road, a sweet spot that we can find in between utilizing the intensive planting systems of grow biointensive in combination with bought-in amendments of compost? Do you think we can find that balance, or are we going to be sucking other systems from their fertility?
If I understand your question correctly, Paul, if we don't grow our own fertility and carbon, then we're going to be, as you say, sucking from other areas, and and we can't do that in order to attain sustainability. Now, that said, if you're in an area of the world where boron is low, or sulfur, or any micro or macro element, then it may be critical to import 1 or 2 times only that nutrient and then seek to capture it within the system and hold on to it. So the system really works best when people are producing within their community their food and recycling all the nutrients back to them so that they don't lose things out of the system. But I think that jump-starting the Grow Biointensive method may be essential in areas where we want to make changes quick, or there's high needs for a whole host of reasons. And we may have to just use local solutions wherever we can to resolve that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. I mean, it's one of our largest challenges is getting sufficient compost, if not water, into many of our gardens. I mean, I think one of the things we have done is we've very much utilized the methodology and systems to get intensive market gardening over to the members of our cooperatives. And at that point, actually support them in subsidized compost and seedlings. Our biggest other challenge is obviously getting people to save seed and to grow their seed. But I think from a financial perspective, it's bordering on actually being sustainable. It's from an environmental perspective that we're still lacking.
Paul, let me ask you, do you feel that people that are beginning or working on engaging in this system, do you see them composting what crops they'd have? I assume they're going to have some corn, sorghum, and other carbon crops. Are they composting them fairly faithfully, or are they wasting that resource?
A combination of both, Steve. For example, in the tropics, in and around KwaZulu-Natal, Durban, they've got far more biomass production, and the composting works very effectively. But also, as you know, in the tropical soils, they're very devoid of minerals, and that compost gets eaten up by the microorganisms extremely quickly. Where I am in the Western Cape, which is a very young Holatian soil, we're literally farming in beach sand. We don't have sufficient water to have effective moisture in compost within our marginalized communities, and we don't really even have sufficient water to effectively have compost break down in the soil. So it's on the one side, yes, it's they're producing, but not enough in the tropics. Here we're not producing enough, and we're actually struggling to effectively make compost and to actually get the mindset of having to make compost. There still is that mindset of it being a crop waste and it needs to be thrown away or destroyed.
Right, that's quite a diversity of challenge in a small geographic area. I think the example from nature where we lose nutrients from a system in tropical soils, nature stores the nutrients in the plants, and there's seldom much in the soil. And so I think mimicking that in the biointensive method and really focusing on the bed crop months, so that at all times there's something, so that we maximize vegetative growth to store nutrients in that vegetation as opposed to the soil where they're so easily lost, is probably a pretty sound practice. I also wonder if specific crops like okra and stuff that has a lot of carbon, and being in the cotton family, it does grow in those arid areas. Any thoughts on okra?
Since the political instability in Zimbabwe over the last decade, there's been almost about 3 million Zimbabwean refugees to South Africa. So we've seen the adoption of tree kale and okra, the lele, more and more within small sustainable, well, not sustainable, but small little market gardens in and around our cities. In KwaZulu-Natal, because of their high Indian communities, it is adopted and it is being utilized. Here in the Western Cape, and within our culture in South Africa, our mixed race are referred to as colored. It's not politically incorrect. It's what we refer to it as. I just want to put that down. Within our communities here, they tend to focus more on root crops and very little vegetable crops. It's mostly carrots, turnips, beetroot, potatoes. So we don't have that level of carboniferous material here. A lot of it is relied upon buying in inputs of, unfortunately, glyphosate contaminated wheat chaff. So we're facing real challenges in the Mediterranean areas. The tropical areas have got a fair amount of biomass, as you said, Steve. But down here, our main challenges are actually growing sufficient for compost. It's a very thin line.
Paul,
Is it?
this was great.
You think
Steve, I kind of need to jump in here for time's sake, just because I know other participants have to go on for other calls, and we want to wrap up the recording, despite the fact that this is a fascinating discussion that I hope you both can continue. Because we're down near the end of the hour, and I just wanted to give a chance to say thank you to you, Steve, for providing this for the broader agriculture community, the broader Food for Peace community, and for TOPS, and I look forward, hopefully, to other opportunities to go deeper into the kinds of questions that you and Paul were just discussing, and that go deeper into the diet farming, the carbon farming, et cetera. I'm going to leave it to Andrea to close up from the top side, but from my side, Paul, Steve, thank you, and thank you to all the participants.
Thank you for hosting us.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you great.
Great, thanks. Steve, thanks very much. Great presentation. And there's so much information in there, so please do have a look at the links that Steve sent out. We will also be sending more information out to you after the webinar, and the recording and everything will be available too. And just to let you know too that this that Steve is really kind of kicking off this series for us for TOPS that will continue over the next however many months we want to continue it, really, that really will kind of dig into more about looking at building resilience in smallholder farming systems through this kind of approach to farming. And in relation to that, we will be sending out a questionnaire to everyone that's joined today, and we would really appreciate your feedback on any of the key points from this presentation that you thought were really interesting, you perhaps would like to dig more into, or other things in relation to this kind of broader topic that would be useful for you, for us to kind of make sure that what we focus on in this series is really what's useful for people on the ground. So thanks everyone for your participation today, and I hope to be in contact with you all soon.